Good morning, everyone, again. I had some technical glitches. Welcome to this webinar. This webinar is part of a cycle of webinars promoted within the FA.B project, Children in Migration. Our project is funded also by the European Commission and Cidis, together with partners of the third sectors coming from Greece, Spain, Malta, Cyprus, and Lisbon at national level. We work to implement the reception system for young unaccompanied migrants, most of them minors, in Europe. We try to promote foster family and family-based reception, and we try to offer alternative forms of reception for this specific target of minors. This cycle of webinars is part of the project, and the purpose of this cycle is to have a better knowledge of the arrival of minors, in particular unaccompanied young minors in Europe. We try to understand the system of reception at the European level and at the level of individual countries. And it is also important to know the country of origins, the context from which these young minors come from, because only knowing the context we can understand the reason for their migration, why they decide to leave their countries, which are the countries they would like to reach, and what is their migration project. Because all these elements contribute to improve our knowledge and consequently our competencies to offer these young migrants the best possible reception. Today, we have again with us Silvia Spinuso of OIM and Cheikh. They will talk about migrants coming from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country, according to the Italian reports, we have around 700 minors coming from Bangladesh. In the ranking of the countries of origin, Bangladesh is ranking 7th after Ukraine, but in the past it was at the first positions of this list, and this variation, this big change concerning the arrivals of young migrants, which is very variable and very heterogeneous, can be also identified in the different countries of origin. In the past, Bangladesh was among the first countries of origin. Now the situation has changed, but there is a specific condition for these migrants coming from Bangladesh, and so it is interesting to understand why do they decide to leave their countries and to reach our country, and what are the drivers and the push factors having an impact on their migration project. Before giving the floor to our guests, I would like to remind you that the webinar is available in several languages. You can listen to the floor in Italian, but you can also listen to it in English, in Spanish, and in Greek.
In greco e in spagnolo
and I kindly ask you to rename yourself. So we would like to see a name and the surname closer to your picture or your photograph. So please try to avoid using codes or number. We would prefer a name and a surname. So now we will have a first part of presentation around 1 hour. Then we will have a break, and there will be time to ask questions or to send comments. So we will open a sort of debate, and then there will be a short break before starting with the second part of the meeting. And we will conclude also the second part with the question and answer and comment. And then we will reach the end of our webinar. So I would like to give the floor to Cheikh Gueye and to Silvia Spinuso for their valuable contribution. Please, we kindly ask you to rename yourself, and we would like to read a name and a surname. Thank you. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar. Thank you, Alessandra, and thank you, Cidis, for this kind invitation. Today, with my colleague, we will offer you this presentation about unaccompanied young migrants coming from Bangladesh. Together, we will try to understand the dynamics of this migration and to have more information about the socio-economic context and the migration project of this migrant. I work for OIM. I've been working for OIM since 2006, and from 2012 I work with the family investigation. I will give you additional information about this activity later on. But I would like to give the floor to my colleague to start this presentation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chef Gueye. I work with the IOM together with Silvia in the project to support the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies, and we try to support family investigation activities, in particular regarding unaccompanied young migrants. Thank you for having me here, and now I will start sharing my screen so that you can see my presentation. Very briefly, because Alessandra has already introduced Cheikh and I in the previous webinar, but just a few words about the International Organization for Migration, founded in 1951. It is the most important intergovernmental agency for migration, and since 2016 is linked to the UN. It is important to clarify that a relevant part of data and reflections that we are going to propose today are the result of years of work of the family investigation team within the IOM mission in Rome, and we work in the Vulnerable Migrants Department within the IOM office in Rome, which also has coordination tasks. The migration profile of these young migrants that we will analyze during this presentation is the result of the quantitative and qualitative investigation made within the family investigation project that IOM has been carrying out since 2008 in collaboration with the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies, and we focus on transit families or families of origin. We focus on minors from Bangladesh, but also from other countries. Our office, the main seat is in Dhaka, works in this field, so we have a long experience in the field, and this is a privilege because thanks to this experience we had the opportunity to enter in close contact with the families of origins, and we will see how important it is to talk directly with the families of these young migrants. Thank you, Cheikh, for helping me with the presentation. First of all, few data just to put things into context and analyze the characteristics of the country. Before focusing on point one and talking about population, few information about the Bangladesh as an independent nation. Bangladesh, the state of Bangladesh, as we know it, was created after the war fought in 1971 against the West Pakistan at that time, today Pakistan. This name had been given after the independence of India from the United Kingdom much earlier than 1947, and at that time there was a distinction between East and West Pakistan, respectively Bangladesh and Pakistan. In this slide you can see some data that are significant for our analysis because they explain the driving factors and the migration factors for this population, in particular for minors. It is a country with a population of 167, almost 168 million inhabitants. Data updated by the UNFPA, which is the UN Fund for Population, and updated at 2022. And in the 5 years 2020-2025, this number will furtherly increase because it is predicted a growth by 1% of the population. In any case, we are talking about a huge population. And it is even more significant if we think that the territory is relatively small, the country is relatively small, so it is densely, very densely populated. So this, just to give you an idea, because this is one of the factors impacting on migration and on some dynamics inducing the migration phenomenon. This number is huge, but it is interesting to see the population composition. More than 68% is aged between 15 and 64. Specifically, the breakdown of this percentage, more than 25% is aged between 0 and 14. Just 6% of the population is aged 65 or older. So, as you can see, it's a young population continuously increasing. If we consider the age 10-19, which is the most interesting for us, it represents 18% of the population, so a very high percentage. Such factors can clearly represent what the migratory drivers can be and why this is a country which is overpopulated. There are many young people. The young population is huge, and they, of course, don't find opportunities, and so the strategies to live contemplate migration, and in particular migration towards other countries. Focusing on point 2, it is important to remember that Bangladesh is ranking 129 for Human Development Index. This index There is a very recent report published in September 2022 by the UNDP, which is the Program for Development of the United States. You can read this report and you can find many other information about Bangladesh and also clear explanation of this Human Development Index. So it is an insight analysis and it is important to understand what this position means for Bangladesh. But what is the Human Development Index? Well, it represents the capacity of a state to guarantee its population certain goals for health and development. So very briefly, you can read this report to find additional information, but it is important to recognize that over the last year, Bangladesh, and also due to the pandemic, which entailed a generalized stop of all the activities. This was true for Bangladesh, but also for the rest of the world. Of course, this lockdown had a negative impact on the economies of many countries. And for Bangladesh, it was a huge step back, considering the improvement of these human development indexes. But it is important to consider this position in the world ranking, and it is important to recognize that notwithstanding the difficulties, the country was able to improve its position, and it is one of the countries in Southern Asia that together with Sri Lanka and India has the best index of human development. If we consider the index measuring inequalities in the country, in this case, Bangladesh loses more than 20 positions in this scale of human development index. Just to mention one example among the many others, it is important to remember that in this country there are still deep differences. It is a country that should improve, notwithstanding the huge improvement made. There are very low percentages in terms of income, education, especially for women, but also the capacity to enter the labor market. They are not sufficiently represented. And when represented, they have non-skilled workers and they work mainly in service and agricultural sector. This just to give you a general picture of the country. But in any case, it is important to remember and to recognize that there are signals of growth. For example, in the years 2003 to 2016, the percentage of women employed reached 26%, which is a huge improvement, and it is important to recognize that. So now that you have an overview of the country and an overview of the population, and also an idea of the biggest economic difficulties, we can focus on point 3. We have mentioned that point before, but it is important to remember that Bangladesh is one of the countries with the highest percentage of citizens living abroad, 7.4 million in 2021, according to the ESA, but a percentage destined to grow, a number destined to grow, but in any case, a relevant data. So the migration is very high in Bangladesh, and this has an impact on migration projects. It shapes Bengali families, and of course it shapes the life of young migrants. So it is true that there is a great trend to migration. It is also important to remember that Bangladesh is one of those countries where the risks correlated to climate change are very high, and they becomes a push factor for migration, together with many other push factors for this country. About climate change, which, as we were saying, can be an endemic migration factor, it is important to mention the risk of floods. Bangladesh is constantly under the threat of flood due to its geographical characteristics. Its geography, it is also important. It is a flat country, very few hills, and so floods are very common and most of the time are devastating and catastrophic. The high density, the high population density, you can read that the number on the screen, it's another factor. And we are referring to a surface of just 147,000 kilometers. So we are talking about a relatively small country compared to its population. And as I was saying, for its peculiar geographic traits made of many rivers and little channels are another element that contributes to the migration profile and climate changes. Recently, climate changes have become even more evident, and I'm referring to monsoon winds that are devastating for the population and provoking many damages to the buildings and to the agricultures, with an impact on the economy of the country. So we can say that it is a country at a high risk of climate change. And when we talk about migration drivers or push factors or attracting factors, now the term includes both trends. So we use this elements, and we can clearly underline that the economic elements are among the most powerful push factors, because these people need to find a solution, need to find the way to survive. And in particularly, young migrants becomes the support for their families. Maybe the head of the family remains in Bangladesh, but this young generation migrates, and this is one of the most interesting factors to consider. There is a prevalence of male migrants, young male migrants, migrating abroad to find a future, to have a job, to find a job. So they migrate. Italy is one of the destinations, but not only Italy. It is important to consider that there are also other areas, in particular the Arab Emirates. The Emirates were another destination for people are coming from Bangladesh. So we have to consider climate factors, economic factors contributing to this migration outflows. And as we said, it is a significant phenomenon, in particular for young male migrants. A study carried out by IOM in 2020, it was an investigation of migration drivers for people from Bangladesh, underlined that lack of job, the unemployment and the impossibility to survive in the 73% of the cases was the driving factors for migration. According to the answers of the respondents to this surveys, and the same respondents mentioned financial problems in general in the 13% of the cases, but in 2% of the cases they also explained that the migration was induced by the fact that they have no hope in their countries. So if we match these percentages and if we aggregate data, it is clear that in this country there are very little opportunities for young migrants, and so finding a hope, finding a future is one of the main reasons pushing these young people to leave their countries. If we want to divide and distinguish migration drivers and distinguish between attraction and push factors, it is important to remember that most of the time these people have a network of family members or people from Bangladesh in other countries, the so-called diasporas. According to a survey carried out in 2020, it was important to observe the presence of a network of people from the same country, and of course the possibility to find a job with a better salary in other countries, and this is a common element in the interviews with the families. So for this reason, that minors and that family decided to invest so much in the journey to transform that journey into a hope, into a job, a well-paid job, possibly. And our colleagues in Dhaka, they are in close contact with the families and they confirm that this is a constant element that confirms and corroborates the reason why they decided to leave their countries. If we focus on the box 4B, it is interesting to observe that there is a gender differentiation in the job placement of people from Bangladesh abroad. And again, we are making reference to an IOM report. So for male, it is easier to work in building sector, construction sector, while for women they work as a family assistant or people working in the families. This kind of subdivision is not specific of the Italian context. This is a general gender differentiation in the job placement. In Italy, in particular, migration from Bangladesh is a male migration in most of the cases. So we have young male migrant. As Alessandra was saying before, recently percentages referring to the arrival of young migrants have changed, and this is correlated with the new flows, the new routes. So we have a global point of view now, and it is a complex phenomenon. It is difficult to explain why this is happening, but we are trying to offer you some hypotheses, and we invite you to see how gender differentiation in migration can be peculiar. In Italy, what we observe is that after a first phase, where, for example, the unaccompanied young migrant becomes adult, finds a job, has a document, has a permit of residence, and can invite a wife, maybe, or the children. This is the typical situation we can observe in Italy, but it is not the only one snapshot of this migration flows and outflows. We like talking about abilities, capacities, but also positive contribution these young migrants give to the economies of their countries, but also of the countries where they live. So they are also an example of resilience, strength. That is why we would like to underline that remittances sent from abroad to Bangladesh are an important item of the economy of Bangladesh. Many local newspapers talk about this important contribution, and the Data Tribune is one of the most common newspaper in Bangladesh. If you are curious, you can look for it and read a few articles, and you will discover that there is enthusiasm and proud about this capacity of young people from Bangladesh to contribute to their local economies. Remittances in 2021 increase until reaching $22 billion. So it is a significant figure. This is a first snapshot. This is a first overview we would like to offer you about the country. It is not sufficient to explain the migration profile and the migration phenomenon. There are many other elements to explain, to understand the need and the will of these people to come, to migrate and to come here in Italy or to other countries. Most of the time, especially for young unaccompanied migrants, the decision to migrate is taken together with the family. So it is a family decision for the benefit of the individual, but also for the benefit of the whole family. So we would like to give you other data about the characteristics and the features of the country to have a clearer idea of this reality and of what is happening in that territory. Every time we add a few details, and this is useful to explain the push and driving factor, it is important to analyze the elements contributing to that decision. In box 1, as you can read in this slide, it is important to remember that in this country there is a significant number of displaced persons. We have mentioned the geographical characteristics of this country. We have mentioned how much such features make this country a target, somehow, a target of natural phenomena and natural climate phenomena that have always been very well known, but we are also referring to what is happening due to climate changes. Very often, floods are catastrophic and they transform into push factors because the nature has a huge impact on the territory and on the activities of humans in that territory. This effect is amplified by the geographical feature and by the high density of the population. All this transforms into an additional vulnerability. In box 2, you can see some data about the high number of internally displaced persons. Cheikh will give you additional information. But remember that Bangladesh is a country where there are many tensions, political tensions, religious tensions. In this case, there are many minorities. You know that it is a Muslim country, but there are also other minorities, not only Muslim minorities, but also minorities belonging to other religions such as Buddhism and Hindu. So it is a complicated place. There is a complex reality. 95% or more are Muslim, but there are also many other realities. If you think about the history of this country and if you consider the many tensions the country has experienced, there is this Hamatia community that has a specific position in the country, and this community is a constant target of internal conflicts. Part of the population can become a displaced person from one day to the following one. But there is more. Because of its position, because of its geographical position, at the border with Myanmar, Bangladesh has welcomed incoming and significant migration flows. You know what happened in Myanmar since 2017 to the persecution of Muslim Rohingya that were forced to enter Bangladesh to find a refuge, to be rescued. Today, our mission in Dhaka manages many camps of Rohingya population and the population from Bangladesh. We are talking about more than 1 million displaced people from Myanmar and refugees from Bangladesh, and I'm referring to data published in May 2022. These people live in precarious conditions, even if assisted in the camps, but their condition is very complicated and challenging. It is also important to mention the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of limited movements and also in terms of impact on the economies of these countries. This was particularly clear during 2021, but this year, in 2022, unfortunately, we haven't final data, but we have observed phenomenon of people from Bangladesh who migrated abroad before the pandemic and returned to Bangladesh after the pandemic. Many activities were closed, and this happened in many other countries, and so you can imagine the difficulties of the people living in these countries, the difficulties to guarantee a decent life for their family. Remember that the first push driver for migration is are economic reasons, and so these people migrated abroad to find better economic conditions. In the next slide, we can read other data. We are giving you many information in this first part of the presentation, but in the second part and later on, we will give you the opportunity to interact. Maybe in a couple of slides we can have a break. Who are the young people from Bangladesh arriving in Italy? Alessandra was mentioning it before, and she was right. Over the last year, we have welcomed many young migrants from Bangladesh. Bangladesh was ranking among the first position in the rankings. And this according to the data of the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies, especially for what concerns young unaccompanied migrants welcomed in Italy. At the moment, I can't remember the exact percentage of people from Bangladesh and the division by gender, but I can tell you that more than 98-99% are young minors, male minors. Girls or young women do not migrate in this way, but maybe they follow the family after a family reunion at a second stage. You can read the percentages. We are talking about significant numbers, especially for what concerns the recent period. But until December 2021, 31st December 2021, you know that the trends in the last few years increased. The trend were increasing in 2021, but also in 2022. But until December 2021, according to the report of the Ministry of Labour, we can read a high number of people, more than 12,000 people of young migrants in the Italian territory. Part of them, almost 3,000, coming from Bangladesh. At that time, end of 2021, Bangladesh was still ranking among the first nations, followed by Egypt, Albania, and Tunisia. As you know, after the war in Ukraine, the percentages have changed and Ukraine ranks first, but after Ukraine the minors from Egypt are returning, so the percentages referring to young Egyptian migrants are increasing again. And in 2022, as Alessandra said before, according to the Ministry of Labour, at the end of November 2022, the percentage decreased. if we consider the people who entered the country in November, you can see a significant reduction, less than 30. What happened? Well, we have anticipated it before. It is difficult to give a single explanation, but we can consider several elements and we can give you an idea based on sound elements. Of course, the impact of the pandemic. For many migrants, it has been difficult to pay smugglers and traffickers to complete the migration project and the migration pathway. Typically, people from Bangladesh, even if the network of traffickers and smugglers is very wide and can cover almost all the routes, also the most difficult routes, and they can also be very creative when they consider the ways to counterfeit passport or find other solutions. So they are very creative in this sense. But part of the routes from Bangladesh were concentrated in Libya. So the first place from people coming from Bangladesh, the first point of arrival was Libya, and then they had to cross the sea and reach Italy through the so-called Western Mediterranean route. So many people from Bangladesh remained blocked in Libya due to the pandemics, due to the limitations of the pandemics, and so for them it was much more difficult to work and to be paid in Libya. So the situation in Libya worsened for sure, and this was an additional limit for people from Bangladesh and an obstacle to reach their country of destination. Italy remains one of the preferred destinations for people from Bangladesh, but this can be a plausible explanation. We should also add other elements. Italy probably is not the only one country. There are other countries of destination, and in this case, it will be interesting maybe in the future collecting data, because you know that data and numbers can give us many information and could explain this decrease in the arrival. We should also consider if, in the meantime, other European countries or non-European countries may have become new destination or more convenient and appealing destinations for people from Bangladesh. A big question mark, but what I'm about to say is not corroborated by data, is that we could consider that part of these migrants decided or attempted to enter the UK before the UK adopted the new asylum act, much more restrictive, not only for what concerns family reunions. It is just an hypothesis corroborated by few data on which we would like to ponder in the next months. And this just to mention figures. What you see in the slide is self-explanatory. And if you focus on point 3, it is important to remember that in addition to the Mediterranean route used by Bengali people, there is also the Balkan route. Through the Balkan route, which crosses former Yugoslavia states,
and enters Europe and, of course, Italy. Recently, many citizens from Bangladesh traveled. Many citizens from Bangladesh crossed that area. And I was reading a report written by our colleagues in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we are receiving this report on a regular basis. Our colleagues can intercept migrants in the camps where they can remain for a period to rest. So our colleagues try to meet them and ask questions so we know more about their intentions, their purpose, their nationality. Well, at the moment, there's no trace of migrants from Bangladesh through that route. There are many people from Afghanistan, Iraq, and surprisingly, there is a new flow of Moroccans crossing that route, and this is also interesting. But all this just to say that when we consider the choice of the destination, the network of diasporas or other family members present or people from the same country present is key, is fundamental. We had a technical problem, the voice was not clear. There is an interference and we will try to solve the problem. As I was saying, there are some changes due also to the network of traffickers and smugglers. And this network of traffickers and smugglers are very common in Bangladesh. And those of you who had the opportunity to talk with young and accompanied migrants, you know that these people are called brokers by the families. And this term gives the idea of how this profile is very common in the life of villages and small communities. May I have the next slide, please? Before focusing on the results of the interviews with families, I would like to focus on another group of interviews carried out by OIM to people from Bangladesh arriving in Italy, both unaccompanied young migrants and young adults. In a significant time frame, which corresponds to the peak of their presence in Europe and in particular in Italy. The OIM project, the name is DTM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, is aimed at tracing and having an indication of the migration flows in Europe. And where possible, if possible, we try to interview the people immediately after their arrival or at their arrival to understand The interviews are carried out with the support of intercultural mediators, and we try to understand the push factor, the reason why they decided to leave their countries, and what are the features of these people arriving in Italy, what kind of journey they had, if they were victim of trafficking, if they were exploited. So we try to collect useful, significant information that help us to better understand migration flows from that country.
860 migranti provenienti dal Bangladesh sono stati
Currently,
intervistati. Una parte di questi erano minori non
860
accompagnati
people from Bangladesh were interviewed in the age range 14-17, and then there was a group of young migrants aged 18-24.
conto di
Consider that
informazioni e se vi
we are
interessa
just
più nello
providing few
specifico c'è un sito
information,
dedicato
so it is just an overview, but
ad
there
hoc
is a dedicated
sulle
website
attività che fa
on the
questo progetto e poi vi
activities
invito
of the
ad andare a
DTM project.
vedere.
You can visit the
Comunque,
website and you can have additional
queste
information.
interviste appunto realizzate sia al
The
momento
interviews carried out
subito dopo lo
at the
sbarco che
arrival
nei centri
or
di
immediately after
accoglienza e
their
transito
arrival,
soprattutto in Sud Italia, ma non solo, anche
especially in the
Nord
south of
Italia e anche
Italy,
nelle
in
regioni
some
al confine
camps,
sia est che ovest
but also in the
terrestre
north of
italiano.
the country and on the east and west borders.
Hanno diciamo così
Well,
potuto mettere
as
in
I was saying,
evidenza
these interviews pointed
alcune
out
importanti
some
informazioni. Intanto
important
sì,
features,
si tratta di
characteristics.
cittadini bangladesi, ma
We are talking
come
about
sapete e per tutto
Bengali
quanto abbiamo detto
citizens, but
rispetto
as you
all'importanza
know,
della diaspora dei network
and
connazionali
because of
presenti
the
in Italia,
importance
è
of
importante anche capire
diasporas
da
and
quali
network of
regioni, da
family
quali
members, it is also
regioni
important to
del Bangladesh
understand
queste persone
from which region do
vengono
they come
principalmente.
from which district
Molti hanno
or
dichiarato di
area.
venire dalla
Many of them
regione di
declare
Dhaka,
to come from
il
Dhaka
che
region, Dhaka division,
questo ecco per aggiungere un pezzettino
and this is an additional
alla traiettoria
information
migratoria
which
di
is
questi minori
precious
può
because it adds
corrispondere o
a
no
piece
alla
to
residenza
the
della famiglia in quella
trajectory.
regione.
So
Mi spiego
it
meglio.
can correspond to the residence of
Spesso e
the family in
volentieri
that region, because remember
quando
that often
specialmente il minore si allontana
when
da casa e quindi inizia
minors
il viaggio
leave their
migratorio, oltre ad
families, leave
aver la
their
famiglia dovuto mettere da parte una somma
country,
spesso e volentieri molto ingente
they have to
per
work
l'organizzazione del
because
viaggio,
to
a volte
organize
c'è
their travel, the
necessità
family
anche per il giovane
must
migrante di
collect a
fermarsi
significant sum
per
of
un
money. So
periodo
the young
all'interno del
migrant
paese
must
e
remain for
svolgere
a period within the
un
country,
lavoro
in this case in
tipicamente
Bangladesh,
più
to work,
facile
to collect
che queste
money.
attività
Most of the time it is
un
easier to
giovane
find a
li trovi
job
nella regione
in
intorno
the
alla capitale, a
areas
Dhaka, piuttosto che
around
nelle vicinanze del proprio
the big
villaggio. Quindi
city of Dhaka or in the
possono
rather than
poi
in the little
anche
villages.
trascorrere dei periodi molto lunghi,
But
di
these young
mesi, se
migrants
non un
can
anno,
remain for
con lo scopo
months,
di
sometimes years, in that
risparmiare e aggiungere
city
questi
to
risparmi a
work
quanto
and
messo già da
save
parte dalle
money
famiglie e essere in
and
grado
to
poi da lì
help the
di proseguire
family
il viaggio. Quindi
financially.
rispetto all'origine dalla regione di Dhaka, ecco, tenete
So
presente che questo
maybe
è
they
vero
come from
perché
Dhaka
sicuramente la
division,
dichiarazione
and this
della
is
persona,
true
ma può
because
corrispondere anche a questi
it was
movimenti
declared
interni
by the
migratori
interviewees, but
interni che
consider
hanno lo
also
scopo
these
appunto di,
internal
come detto,
movements
recuperare
aimed at
tutti
spending
il denaro
time in the
necessario a
country to
compiere
work
questo
and collect
viaggio
money
migratorio al
to
di fuori
face the migration
del
journey.
paese. E poi ci sono altre regioni un pochino più a sud
Then there
di
are
Dhaka,
other regions
da cui provengono
in the
tantissimi
south of Dhaka.
migranti che risiedono
Many
in Italia, che
migrants
sono
come from
Madaripur
there,
e Shariatpur.
Madaripur and Shariatpur in
Chi di
particular.
voi lavora con i minori bangladesi
If you
sicuramente ha
work
sentito
with the young
queste
people from
regioni
Bangladesh,
perché
I'm sure you have
molti provengono
heard
da famiglie
the name
che
of these
abitano in
regions, and you know
villaggi
that many
di
of
quella
these
zona.
young people come
Regioni
from
più a nord,
families
quali
living in that area.
quella di Sylhet sono
The region in the
poco
north,
rappresentate in
like
Italia
Sylhet region, are
perché
not
la
very
ragione
much represented in Italy
di
because the
quella regione nello
population from
specifico
that region in
diciamo
particular,
storicamente è in passato immigrato
historically
più nel
speaking,
Regno Unito
opted
che in
for the
Italia.
UK rather than
Questo
Italy.
non toglie appunto che una
But
percentuale
we cannot exclude that a small percentage of
interessante
people
viene
from
anche
that region is also
da
present,
altre regioni quali Chittagong o Kulna.
as well as
Detto
from
questo, rispetto
Chittagong
ad
or
quello che
Khulna.
avvengono all'interno del Bangladesh, ci sembra anche molto interessante
It is
parlare un po'
also
di
interesting
quella
to
che era la
talk
situazione
about
pre-partenza. In
the
queste interviste
situation
svolte appunto
before
dal
the
progetto
departures, and
DTM
the
ci danno
interviews carried out
fanno
by
sì che
DTM
possiamo fare
project
un'incursione anche
give
rispetto
us
a
a
questo.
clearer
E,
overview also on
la
this aspect.
grande maggioranza dei minori,
The majority
come
of
dicevamo prima,
young
queste interviste
migrants
comprendevano sia interviste a minori che a giovani adulti.
in the
Nello
past, the
specifico quelle
interviews
che sono state
were
fatte con
interviews to
minori,
young unaccompanied migrant
chiaramente
and young
per questo
migrant.
specifico gruppo era importante
For this
indagare
specific
il
group, it
livello
was important
il
to
livello
focus on
scolastico
young
proprio
unaccompanied
da questi
migrants in
ragazzi prima della
particular to
partenza. In
understand
questo
their level
caso
of education before the departure.
la grande maggioranza di loro ha dichiarato di aver
The
completato la scuola
majority of the
primaria di primo
interviewees
grado, nel
declared that they
50%
completed the
dei
first
casi,
cycle of
e di secondo
education,
grado
and it
solo in
corresponds
più del
to
30% dei
50%
casi.
of the
E
answers.
molto
And
pochi,
just
pochissimi, direi un 4% solo, avevano
about
completato il
30%
ciclo di
declared to
istruzione
have
secondaria.
completed a second cycle of education,
Perché è
and just
importante
4% a higher
sottolineare
level
questo
of
dato? Non
education.
solo
And
perché
it is extremely important to take into
ovviamente
account
ci dà un'idea
this
anche delle
datum
difficoltà
because we have an idea of the
trovare
difficulties
un'alternativa
these young people had
di
to
studio e di lavoro
face to find an
rimanente.
alternative for
E
study and for
torniamo a
work in
quello che
their
abbiamo detto
country.
all'inizio, cioè a quei migranti che hanno
And it is
in
important
quel
to remember
sondaggio
what we
Pulso
have mentioned at the
dell'OIM
beginning
del
of this
2020 che hanno
meeting.
detto che era la
The
mancanza di
According
speranza a
to the
motivarli alla partenza,
IOM
anche se non
2020
erano la grande
surveys,
maggioranza,
one of
quindi
the
ci sono
reason,
stessi
one of the
dicendo che
main
c'era una percentuale di
push
persone
factor
che
was the lack
faceva
of
riferimento
hope
a questa
in the
mancanza di
future, the
speranza.
lack of
Sicuramente
opportunities
la
in
bella
their
opportunità di
countries,
riuscire a proseguire
the
gli
lack of
studi
opportunities to
per
complete their study, to
quasi sempre
find
difficoltà
a
economiche
job,
può essere
and this is due in most of the
legata a
cases
questa
to
sensazione di non
economic
riuscire, come dire,
difficulties. And of course,
a
this
poter
lack of
sperare di
opportunity
trovare un
is
lavoro e con
correlated
questo
to the
lavoro
lack
mandare avanti la propria
of
famiglia.
hope
Ma
in
c'è
finding
anche
a
un
job and
altro
having a family.
motivo importante
But
da
there is also
sottolineare.
another
Si
important
è
reason to
notata una
underline.
correlazione molto
There
forte
is a
fra livello di
correlation
istruzione, basso
between
livello di
level of
istruzione
education, low level of
dei
education
minori migranti,
of
ma anche degli
young
adulti migranti e
migrants,
rischio,
unaccompanied migrants,
possibilità
and young
di
adults,
essere
and
sfruttati, di andare
risk
incontro a
possibility
maltrattamenti, a
to be
violenza nel corso del viaggio
exploited,
migratorio. Quindi
maltreated, to be victim
questa è
of violence
un'informazione anche
during the
molto
migration
importante per
journey. And
partire,
this is
ritorna solo per
another key
capire
element
quali sono
to
i rischi a cui sono
understand
andate incontro
the
queste
risks
persone
these
e nel
people
tentativo di
faced
arrivare in Europa, in
in the
particolare in Italia.
attempt to reach Europe and
Ehm,
Italy.
un po' di domande poi sempre fatte nell'ambito del progetto di DTM
Other
cercavano di indagare un po' sulla
questions
situazione occupazionale prima della
by the
partenza
DTM project
e
try to
ovviamente
investigate on the occupational
anche se
situation before
ovviamente
the
può sembrare
departure.
un po' presuntuoso, ma il 40% dei
It
minori ha
may
dichiarato
seem a bit presumptuous, but
che era studente
40% of
almeno
migrants
fino a
declare to be
quando appunto
students
è riuscito
before
a
the
proseguire
departure,
gli studi. Stiamo parlando, come abbiamo
and we
detto
are
prima,
talking
di
about
un 50% che ha dichiarato di aver completato solo la
50%
scuola
who
dell'obbligo, quella
declare
di
to have completed
primario
just
di
the
primo grado.
obligatory education,
Un
the first level of
terzo si diceva
education. One
disoccupato
third
e
declare to be
un
unemployed,
restante
and
circa il
the
20% aveva
remaining
sicuro di essere
30% to have a job
occupato autonomamente.
and to
Il
be
settore informale in Bangladesh è
autonomous. The
molto
informal
molto esteso
sector in Bangladesh
e quindi
is
essere impiegato autonomamente può anche
very
voler
common,
dire
and being
lavorare in
autonomously,
un'economia
be
di
an
quasi
autonomous
sussistenza
worker may also
dando
mean
una mano
working in countryside, in farms, helping a family or someone else or another family member in the farming activity. So this gives us an idea of the difficulties, also working difficulties or economic difficulties they had to face in their country of origin.
Quindi, andando un po' a stringere su questo, abbiamo detto
Just to
appunto della
summarize,
situazione occupazionale prima della partenza
we focus
di quanto dichiarato da minori
on
e
their
giovani adulti,
situation before the
e del
departure,
fatto
on
appunto
the
che
basis of the
sia quello
declaration of
immigrati
young
che quello di
unaccompanied
situazione
migrant and young
di
migrants.
questi
We
migranti
focus on their level of
hanno portato
education,
è basso, medio-basso.
and we know that it is low, generally
Di
low.
questi tre box vi
And
inviterei a guardare
I
soprattutto
would like
l'ultimo, un
you
po'
to focus on the third
l'abbiamo
box in this
accennato, ma
slide,
è molto importante considerare che
because it is
per la
extremely
distanza
important to
geografica, ma anche
consider
proprio
that
per
due to
il
the
costo
geographical
che questo
distance, due to the
viaggio porta
cost,
con sé,
and due to the
molti di quei
difficulties,
giovani adulti arrivati da giovani
many
adulti
of the
in
young
Italia,
migrants who arrived in Italy as
regolarmente
young
da giovani adulti,
adults,
sono partiti dalle
maybe
loro
they
case
left their
madreliane quando erano
countries
ancora minorenni.
where they were
Quindi
minors.
le tappe
So the
intermedie
steps, the intermediate
non solo
steps,
affrontate
were
per passare,
difficult,
per
of
affrontare il
course.
passaggio
And you know that there
geografico in
were
paese all'altro,
intermediate
possono essere
steps
state
to
molto,
afford
molto
the travel.
importanti,
And consider that these
sappiamo da molti
steps
che
may
loro
have
si
been
sono
pretty
fermati
traumatic.
per
Many
mesi,
of
per
these young
anni in
migrants
Libia,
remained for
che
months or years in
molti
Libya
possono aver
to work.
scelto inizialmente di migrare
Many
negli Emirati
decided
Arabi e
to
poi
go to the
non avendo più la possibilità di
Emirates at
rimanere
the
lì,
beginning,
hanno a un certo
but then
punto
they hadn't the opportunity
scelto
to
di
remain,
continuare
and
vivendo
they
verso l'Europa. Insomma,
opted
le
for
combinazioni
Europe.
sono le
They
più
decided to
varie,
continue
ma
their journey
tutto ciò,
heading Europe.
come
So there are
potete ben
many
immaginare, il
different
rischio poi
combinations,
di
but
sfruttamento è
the
sempre dietro
risk
l'angolo. Lo
of being
vedremo
exploited has always
dopo
been present. We
con il
will
collega.
focus on that in the second part of the
Importante
presentation
sottolineare
with my colleague, but it is
sempre
important
da
to
queste interviste
underline
che
that
quando agli intervistati è stato chiesto di dare
when the
un'idea del costo
interviewees were asked
pagato
about the cost,
ai
about the
trafficanti,
money
agli
paid
smuggler
to
per questi
traffickers and
viaggi, queste
smugglers
persone hanno
for the
indicato una
migration
media di
journey,
5.000
they
dollari
mentioned
a testa,
an
che
average
è
of
un costo
$5,000
altissimo.
each one, which is a very
Altissimo
high
non solo in sé,
cost.
perché è una
Not
cifra
only
molto
because it
rispetto,
is a
ma
lot
proprio
of money, it
perché
is a significant amount of money,
paragonato insomma
but
alle capacità
because we
economiche
have to
delle
compare
famiglie
it to
è
their
volubile
economic
aver
possibilities.
venduto, se
Probably many
avevano
families
il
were
piccolo appezzamento
forced
di
to
terra a
sell
disposizione,
a
e
parcel
sappiamo
of
quanto
land
un
if
appezzamento
they
di
had
terra
it, and we
sia
know how
importante
valuable it is in these
in
countries
quella
to have
condizione, in
a
quel
parcel
paese
of land.
in cui appunto, come abbiamo visto, c'è
It is
sovraffollamento e
an
il
overcrowded
territorio
country, remember
è un
that, and the
territorio
territory
piccolo.
is small.
Oltre ad aver venduto quello di cui
So
erano
they had
eventualmente in
to
possesso,
sell
ci sono i debiti che la
their
maggior
own
parte di
property,
loro
and
hanno fatto
in most of the
con
cases
parenti,
they
con
had
amici
debt. They
o
have debts with
direttamente con
family
anche
members
dei trafficanti, e
or
che
with the
spesso e
network
volentieri
of
questi giovani che arrivano
traffickers
qui si
that
trovano a dover ripagare mandando
most
avanti
of the
su
time
questo,
these young
perché poi
migrants
ne
have to
parleremo più nello
repay
specifico dopo.
for the debt. But we will
Ultima
focus on
slide
that
prima
in
di
the second
queste,
part of the
e
meeting.
d'accordo
And
mi
then,
fermerei un attimo per
Alessandra,
le eventuali domande,
if you
perché
agree,
dopo
we can have a
iniziamo
break, we
invece a
can
parlare
answer a
nello
few
specifico
questions,
sulle
and
indagini
then
familiari.
we will
Quindi
focus on
questa,
family
per mettere
investigation. So this
un
slide
po'
is a sort of
d'introduzione a queste
summary to
interviste
conclude
appunto
the introduction.
fatte dal progetto di TN ai minori e giovani adulti in
And to
arrivo in
complete
Italia,
the
è un po' diciamo una
DTM
sintesi
project, it's a sort of
di
synthesis
quanto hanno dichiarato
of
le
the
persone
results of
intervistate,
what
e
these
di
people
nuovo,
declared.
come
And
ho parlato
again,
proprio all'inizio,
as we said at the beginning of this webinar, a key feature, a key push factor is money. So an economic reason to leave their country. Most of these interviewees answered that money was the main reason for leaving their country. We have already explained the consequences of these economic difficulties and what are the elements inducing these migrants to leave their country. Because migration to Europe is most of the time considered as the real alternative to have money for themselves and for their family. But this is not the only reason given by the interviewees. We have to consider also significant percentage. We are talking about 38% of the interviewees who mentioned violence and personal violence and the need to find an alternative, to find protection in Italy. In this case, we can have different situations, the scenarios can be different. We can have reason purely correlated to personal persecution. These people can ask for an international protection, remember that, but there are also other reasons. And violence is one of the push factors. We should also consider some family situations, some peculiar family situations that are definitely more common among Pakistani migrants, and I'm referring to the need to escape from family fights, most of the time correlated to the property, to the lands. And I would stop here because the other reason, the other push factors are self-explanatory. And before focusing on the second part of the presentation, what the families declare, I would wait because, as I said, this is the topic of the second part of the presentation. Probably, if Alessandra agrees, we can have a break just to see if there are questions. Yes, thank you, Silvia. I agree with you. We need a break because we had some technical problems, especially with the channels for translation. So we have some interferences. So it's worth to have a break. We can have the space for the questions. I hope you can hear. Thank you, Silvia, for this very interesting presentation in this country. And also thanks to the many sources of data we can for those who work with many minors in Italy, it's you know that our reference document is the report published by the Ministry of Social Policies on a monthly basis and on a semester.
every semester. And there are also insights about other countries. You have personally worked on the insight about Bangladesh. So if we want to compare this data at the European level, for example, FA.B is a part of a European project, and sometimes it is important to have a confrontation within the European context to analyze the legal framework, the system of reception. We know that every country has a different and peculiar situation, and we know that this situation cannot be compared with the situation of other countries. So, is it difficult to collect data? And this is my question. And I think that this report that you are curating every year, it's a milestone. It is very important. How can we have exhaustive information about the presence of minors in other European countries? Thank you, Alessandra, for this observation and for this question. And yes, for
Grazie
Italy,
Alessandra, assolutamente sì.
the
Intanto
monthly
a
report
livello
and the
per quanto
insight
riguarda il panorama
published every
italiano,
6 months
sicuramente
by the
i report sono
ministry
mensili, ma
are really valuable and
gli
they give
approfondimenti
a clear
semestrali del Ministero
overview.
sono veramente una
They can
panoramica che
give
aiuta ad ampliare
important
lo
elements
sguardo e che
to reflect.
appunto può dare, può
But it is
fornire tanti
also
elementi in più
true
di ragionamento e di
that
riflessione. È
as we
pure
were
vero
trying to
che
explain in the first part of
un
this
po'
presentation, the
cercavamo
scenario
di
is
raccontarlo nella prima
continuously
parte
evolving.
della presentazione di
And
oggi.
this happens for
Lo
many
scenario
different
è
reasons.
continuamente in
We are in
movimento,
a
muta
historical moment
continuamente e
where,
per tante
together with
diverse
the
ragioni.
same,
Ci troviamo in un
let's
momento
say,
storico in cui
mutations due
insieme
to
i
the
soliti,
routes,
tra
the
virgolette, soliti
traffickers.
mutamenti
You know
determinati
that the
dalle,
traffickers are always
dalle rotte che
changing
i
the
trafficanti
routes.
cercano sempre di cambiare nella, come dire, con
We
l'obiettivo
know
di
that for
massimizzare sempre i
Bangladesh,
loro
this is
profitti.
particularly true because the travel
Nel
is
caso
very
della
long, the
migrazione dei
journey
bangladesi
is
questo è
challenging and
particolarmente vero proprio
demanding,
perché
and
appunto il viaggio da
Bangladesh,
affrontare è
more than
lungo
other nations,
e,
cannot do it
e più di
in an
altre
autonomous way.
nazionalità
I
non
mean, the
può essere
migrants cannot do it by
affrontato in maniera
themselves. They need
totalmente
to be
autonoma.
supported by
Quindi
the
da una
traffickers
parte
in
c'è
this
questo
case. So there
continuo
are routes
cambiamento, questo continuo
that
aggiornamento delle
are
rotte
more favorable for
pro
traffickers.
domo
It is
trafficanti. Da
also
un'altra parte ci
important
siamo
that
trovati di
we
fronte
faced
a situazioni
people,
mai viste
we
prima,
face a situation and people
primis la
face a
pandemia,
situation
poi
that are
la guerra in
unprecedented.
Ucraina, che
The
hanno a
pandemic
loro volta avuto
crisis,
degli
economic
impatti
crisis,
molto
temporary
molto
blocks,
significativi in termini di
impediments.
blocchi e momentanei, come dire,
So
impedimenti
it was very difficult,
rispetto
and it has
appunto
been very difficult for people to
a queste
enter
rotte, quindi alla
Europe,
possibilità
and of
delle
course the
persone
war in
di
Ukraine
entrare e
that
cercare di entrare in
raised
Europa.
the
E
bar,
la
if
guerra in
we can
Ucraina
say
che ha
so, offering
ovviamente
other difficulties, other
alzato, come
hurdles
dire,
also within the European countries,
artigli
and made
nuovi
even
all'interno
more
anche
complicated
dei paesi
the
europei, e
movements
questo,
of
se è
migrants
possibile, ancora più
within Europe.
complicato
How can
il
we
movimento di questi
have a
migranti
collective
all'interno
approach, a
dell'Europa?
collective
Com'è
overview
possibile
about this
ragionare in
phenomena?
maniera corale, come
Well, we
dicevi
are
tu, da un
lucky
punto di vista
enough
europeo
to
su
be
questi
able to talk
fenomeni?
directly to the
Per
offices
quanto ci
present in the
riguarda,
other countries, and
abbiamo la
this is a
fortuna di poter
privilege,
interloquire
and
direttamente con
we
gli
can do
uffici
that,
presenti negli altri
but
paesi, e come dire, non è una prerogativa solo nostra, ma le realtà che possono, come dire, far riferimento a
but there are also other realities that can be
a più
supported by many offices
uffici in
spread
diversi paesi,
in
sicuramente
different
hanno
countries.
vantaggi
I
in più.
would like to
Penso,
mention
non so,
Caritas
anche alla
network,
rete
but just to
Caritas, tanto
mention
per dirne
one
una,
of
ma
the
insomma
many.
ce
So for
ne
sure,
sono
there is
tante
a
altre. Quindi
work
c'è
which is carried out
sicuramente
internally But it would be useful to create a network among the operators in the field, in the sector, and it is something that together with the Cheikh we would like to do in the future. And Alessandra, we would like also to involve FA.B. We met FA.B., just to give you an example, because they invited us to a field visit. But then we realized that confronting about the different actions carried out in the different territories and only experimenting together we can have a clear picture. So maybe we could do something good for next year. We could create a better network for next year, involving all the stakeholders, because we believe this is the only one way to be not maybe at pace or at the vanguard with what's happening, because we know that reality is always quicker than what we can be, but to try to have updated information. Yes, I totally agree with you, and you are right. We experienced so many endogenous and exogenous changes. So changes internal to the countries, but also external to the countries of origin, affecting the countries of transit. So there are so many variables and so many changes that it is impossible to monitor them. And I totally agree with you. The second question is about these brokers, these people that are organizing the journeys. What is their impact also on the narrative and on the behavior of these young migrants? What do they have to declare? Because we believe that they know what to say and what to avoid. In several circumstances, when we had welcomed minors coming from Bangladesh, we had the impression that they were instructed in a very accurate way. So they knew exactly what to say, what to avoid, and it was difficult to talk to them, to work with them, and to try to dismantle this load of information they received. Economic reasons are paramount, we know that, but we also had we have also met young migrants who declared to be of an age, even if they weren't, because they needed to work. But you know that the reception system in Italy is different, and they could be facilitated declaring to be minors. Yeah, well, yes, you are right. Unfortunately, also in this case, this country is a puzzle of many different factors, all factors contributing to the narratives, to the story. They are told it is sufficient to arrive, you can start working, you can't work in your country because you don't have a title, a sufficient title, but you can work in Italy, you can have a salary, you can survive. So these young migrants are forced to repeat a sort of script they learn by heart, because the main purpose is to be able to send money to their families. So on the one hand, there are these minors, 16, 17 years old boys, and all the expectation of the families are on their shoulders, because their families invest all they have to pay a very expensive journey. You know that the price depends on the route, depends on the capability of the local brokers and what the local broker can offer in that very moment. So these are the figures permeating the society of Bangladesh. They are present everywhere in the little
la
villages
società
in Dhaka
bangladese, sono presenti in ogni punto,
at
dal
the point
villaggio
of
di origine
arrival in
della
Italy.
famiglia
We
a
know
Dhaka,
that
al
sometimes
punto di
they
arrivo in Italia,
put
e
the young
sappiamo
migrants
che
on the
arrivano
train, on the
addirittura
bus,
in qualche caso
and from there,
a
this
mettere il
young
ragazzo sul
boy
treno o
goes
sull'autobus per
directly
farlo
to
arrivare
another
poi alla
country, maybe very
destinazione
far
in
from
Italia, che
uh,
può essere appunto la
Bangladesh,
città
in
X
Italy, or in other
rispetto
countries. So these elements
appunto
are
a quello che è
deeply
la rete di connessione.
rooted in the
Dicevo,
narratives,
permeano talmente tanto la
and
società
they can
bangladese, la
also,
narrazione, rispetto
and
anche
it can be also
a quello che si vede
conflicting with
nei
what we
villaggi.
see. I remember that a few years ago we
Ci
were
è
in
capitato
Bangladesh for a monitoring
di essere
mission,
in
and the
Bangladesh
people
qualche
in
anno
the
fa per una
village
missione di
tells you the
monitoraggio,
houses of the
e
people
le
who
persone all'interno del
have been
villaggio ti
to
indicano come
Italy,
prima
what they
cosa le
did,
case di
because
chi è
that
stato in Italia
family
e
is a
che cosa
family
hanno
with a
potuto fare,
relative in Europe, in
perché quella è
particularly
una
in
famiglia
Italy.
che ha un parente in Europa.
So when you arrive in
Si
these
dice in Europa,
villages,
sì, in
you
Italia in
already
particolare.
receive the
Quindi
narrative. There is
ecco,
already a
una,
storytelling
come
ongoing,
dire,
which is
una
supported
narrazione
by the network
che
of
continua a avere
family
questo supporto da
members.
parte del network
And this
di connazionali che vivono
narrative
qui,
is
che è amplificata
amplified by these
da
brokers
broker che hanno
who have a huge
broker, in questo caso li
network.
chiamo proprio
Many of
broker
them
perché hanno
also lives
una
in
rete
Italy, and they are the
spessissima,
last
parte della rete
ring
sono
of
anche
this
persone
long
che
chain
vivono
of
in Italia e
traffickers
che
and
sono l'ultimo
smugglers.
anello
And the
di questa
ice on
rete
the
di
cake
smuggler,
is
di
that
trafficanti. E ciliegina sulla torta,
especially for
una purtroppo
migrants,
capacità,
not
non
the
nel caso
migrants
di
who
quelli noi,
pretend
come
to be
dicevi tu
adult to
Alessandra, e ce
start
ne sono
working.
tanti che si fingono
Unfortunately,
adulti pur di iniziare a
they
lavorare,
force
ma al
these young
contrario c'è anche una
migrants
capacità
to have
immensa di produrre
counterfeit
documentazione
documents
affinché
and
giovani
to
adulti
access to a
possano
higher level of
presentarsi come
protection.
minori e accedere a un livello di protezione
And
che sanno
they know
essere
very well
ben
how
preciso
this
in Italia.
network
C'è una
works, and
conoscenza
they
di
know
queste
very
reti
well how to
approfondita. Cheikh,
offer
vedo che magari vuoi
opportunities.
aggiungere qualcosa su questo, proprio
Cheikh, if
anche
you
sulle
want to add
opportunità di
something,
cui
yes,
possono
it is
far
a
sì
very
che,
complex
a cui possono
network.
accedere poi nei paesi di
Unfortunately, it is working
destinazione.
very
È
well.
una
These
complessa rete
young
che
people
funziona
make
purtroppo
debts,
molto
they have
bene
to
e crea
repay
dei
for
debiti
these
che
debt,
questi
and this
ragazzi
is a sort of
Cheikh, di cui
burden.
tu insomma
Yes,
ti sentono in dovere
I
di estinguere il prima
totally
possibile.
support what Alessandra was saying.
Assolutamente, in
There
effetti
are
quello che diceva
some
Alessandra è molto importante, la
elements
decostruzione dei
that
preconcetti
are some
e
information that are
cercare
given
insomma
to these
di
young
chiarire
migrants, and it
alcune
is
roviglie,
important
perché nella
when
maggior
we
parte dei
deal with
casi i
these young
minori
migrants to bear in mind that they
bangladesi che
are
arrivano sul territorio
manipulated,
italiano sono spesso
misinformed,
molto manipolati da questi
they
broker
receive a
e
lot of
disinformati anche
wrong
insomma
information. For example, in Sicily,
dai
we met
broker stessi.
many
Ad
young
esempio,
minors
nei punti di sbarco in
arriving
Sicilia ci
with
siamo trovati a interagire con dei minori
fake birth
che
certificates
arrivavano con
where they
dei certificati di nascita, insomma,
results
falsi,
they
che
turn to be much
veniva
younger
riportato
than their
un'età
real age.
molto
And
minore
then what
rispetto,
happened?
insomma, alla vera
They
età
declared
dei minori. E poi cosa
they gave
succede, insomma,
false
durante questo
information about
percorso di
their
ricambio?
identity, and
Dichiarano, insomma,
once
delle
they
false
reached
generalità e
the
poi
adult age,
quando
of course, they had
raggiunge la maggiore
problems
età per
because,
continuare, insomma, il percorso di
for
integrazione, i
example, in this
problemi
moment,
iniziano a
IOM
nascere
is
e
trying to involve
per
diplomatic
esempio proprio in
authorities
questo momento
to raise
IOM sta
awareness and to
cercando di
support them
coinvolgere le
to
autorità
understand
diplomatiche
what's
nel
the problem
sensibilizzare loro e
correlated
nel
to
parlare con
the
loro e supportare loro nel
refusal
capire quale è la
and to
problematica legata
the
al rifiuto
passport
delle autorità
denied
diplomatiche di
because
rilasciare un
there
passaporto,
were
insomma, in
doubts
tutti i
about the
paesi
age. Most of the time, in the birth
terreni. Quindi
certificates,
spesso
there
quello
is
che
a
succede è
false
che non
date of birth
matchano la
or
data di
false
nascita, insomma,
personal data, and
delle generalità che
this because they
avevano i
are
propri paesi di
induced
origine
to
con le
do so,
generalità
to
che
tell lies.
condividono,
So in this
insomma,
phase, It is extremely important, especially for those who work with young migrants and in particularly minors, to work, to have a better communication, to teach them that here in Italy there is a reception system, but also to tell them that if they tell lies about their personal data, they will have negative consequences in the future. Later, we can talk about vulnerabilities in the reception country and vulnerability in the country of origin, and we can also develop the discussion. Yes, Sheikh. We also had this experience. Adult people, clearly adult people who declare to be minors, and this, of course, had consequences. And also, police headquarters had to take action because. Of course, we are talking about false statements, and this has an impact on the stay and on the documents. Last question, and then we will start the second part. Once in Italy, what are the main working activities for citizens coming from Bangladesh? Also, on this point, we will give you additional information during the presentation. What are the most common jobs and what are the risks? Okay, thank you. So we can go on. Thank you so much. So we can continue and we can talk about what are the family investigation and what we can learn about from the meeting with the families. We have this privileged perspective, and so we can maybe know more about the families of these young migrants. We can meet them, we can talk to them, we can ask questions. Many of you, most of you, I think, are aware of that, but family investigation are imposed by law in Italy. There is a decree of the minister that was included by the Zampa law, in the Zampa law, and they are compulsory. They should be carried out in any case if the people who has the responsibility of the migrants and of the minors feel it is appropriate to do that. In our opinion, it is always useful to ask for the activation of family investigation tools through the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies. As I was saying before, in Italy, we have been carrying out this task since 2008, and over the years we have met many families, also from Bangladesh, and we were able to understand the condition of the minors. We could compare the reports by social services compiled by social workers, and we compared such declaration with the declaration of the families, and at the very end we produce a report which is useful for the reception facility and for all the people involved in the reception of the migrants in Italy. Now we should see an additional slide about what the family told us about the main reasons inducing the migrants to come to Italy. Could you please share the presentation and the screen? Probably Cheikh is no longer connected.
Vedo Cheikh collegato, forse è caduta la linea. Ci provo da qua, vediamo un attimo.
Just give me the time to upload the presentation. Probably there was an interruption in the line, in the connection.
Perché non lo vedo proprio, probabilmente c'è un'interruzione.
Can you see my screen?
Ditemi se riuscite a vedere schermo intero e spero di riuscire a fare avanti e indietro.
Sì, perfetto.
Ecco, Ci siamo. Quindi vi dicevo, quello che ci sembrava interessante condividere con voi è che queste interviste in profondità con le famiglie, c'è un questionario predisposto che è
We
stato rivisto
have
poi nell'arco del
been supported
tempo
by
e
our colleagues
è
in the
stato
countries of
raffinato anche
origin
con l'aiuto proprio dei nostri
because
colleghi
it was
nei
important to
paesi di
have a
origine e
very
reso quanto più
homogeneous questionnaire. Most
possibilmente
of the questions are
omogeneo. È
open
un questionario
questions,
in cui la maggior parte delle
and
domande
it is
sono aperte
important
perché
to give the
l'obiettivo è
family
quello
the opportunity
di
to talk
far
clearly
sì che la
about
famiglia si
the
esprima
expectation of the migrants,
come dire,
expectation of
quanto
the
più
family.
possibile rispetto alle aspettative del minore e alle
Over the
aspettative della
years,
famiglia.
we have analyzed the
Su
content
appunto
of
nell'arco di tutti
specific
questi anni,
sections of the
analizzando il
questionnaire,
contenuto
and we were
in
able
particolar modo
to
di alcune sezioni
make
del questionario
a
di indagine,
summary
abbiamo
of the
potuto
main
trarre
reasons
appunto
inducing
una
young
sintesi
migrants to
rispetto
migrate, and in particularly to
alle
migrate in Italy.
motivazioni principali che
The
spingono i
family
ragazzi a migrare
interviewed,
e a migrare in Italia. Intanto queste famiglie intervistate
well,
per la maggior parte dei
most of
casi,
the
queste
features of the
bullet
families
point vi
are
riportano un
summarized
po'
in
il
this bullet
trend
point. Most of these families
della
live in
maggior
rural
parte
context,
appunto delle
in
interviste con
small
le famiglie.
villages.
Si tratta di famiglie che vivono in
Some
contesti
of
rurali,
them
in
very
villaggi molto piccoli,
isolated, some of them
piccoli o
with
molto piccoli, alcuni anche
big
molto isolati, non
problems,
tutti, ma alcuni
living
con grossi problemi di
on
isolamento
agriculture
e
or economies of
che vivono
subsistence.
spesso di un'economia agricola,
If
a volte di pura sussistenza. L'abbiamo detto prima, ma se c'è, come dire,
I can
un potere
define the
riguardo
real
alla
power of
connessione
an authentic
vera
connection
che arriva anche
is
nel
the word
piccolo
of
villaggio,
mouth.
oltre appunto al
The word of
passaparola e alla
mouth from the
narrazione
migrants who have
dei
already
migranti
make this
che hanno
journey,
già
and they know very
compiuto
well
questo
the
viaggio,
capillary
sono
chains of
capovedette
smugglers
dei
and
trafficanti, dei
traffickers with
kidnapper che hanno
ramifications also in
ramificazioni
Europe.
ovunque in
And
Bangladesh
these
e
smugglers
anche in
and
Europa e che,
traffickers
come
are
dicevamo
considered
prima,
as operators.
sono
That is why they
considerati
are
operatori, tra
defined as
virgolette,
brokers,
per questo
as well as
chiamati broker alla pari di
the common brokers. We know the
qualsiasi altra
common
figura
operators that
tra
can work in those
virgolette
countries.
operatore che
From the
possa essere
interviews
presente
with the
in quel
families,
paese.
in particular
Dalle
families
interviste con
of
le
young
famiglie,
migrants and
qui
young
il
minors
riferimento soprattutto era alle
arriving
interviste
through the
fatte
DTM
ai
project,
giovani migranti, ai
but
minori
differently from what
bangladesi
they
nell'arco
declared in those
sul progetto
interviews,
DTM,
when
a
we could
differenza
observe
di
a
quanto
high
dichiarato
percentage
da
of
quelle
people
interviste in cui avevamo visto
who
che c'era
decided to
una
migrate
percentuale anche
also to
consistente di
move
persone che
away
dichiaravano di
from
di aver deciso di
persecution
migrare
or
anche per
conflicts
allontanarsi
or
da
problem with the community of origin. When we
problemi di
talk to
persecuzione personale,
family of
conflitti in essere,
unaccompanied
eccetera.
migrants living in
Quando
Italy,
ci troviamo ad
this
intervistare le famiglie dei
motivation
minori non accompagnati
is
che sono in Italia,
never mentioned, almost
questa
never mentioned,
motivazione
is a
è una
residual
motivazione
motivation.
talmente residuale che sì, direi assolutamente di poca
And
rilevanza.
this is an important
Quindi questo
element
come
emerging from the
primi
analysis
grandi
of the
temi,
interviews
ripeto,
carried out
emersi
over the years.
dall'analisi del contenuto di tantissime interviste fatte nel corso degli anni.
What
Andando
we have
avanti,
discovered, and what it's
quello
worth
che
mentioning,
invece
is that all the families,
risulta importante
actually very few
sottolineare
cases
è che
not
tutte le
falling
famiglie,
within this
sono pochi
category,
casi, devo
very
dire la
few
verità,
families
di
omit
famiglie che
to say what they spent
omettono di
for the
indicare
migration
quanto
journey, for the
sia stato
migratory
spento al
journey.
momento del
Most of the
viaggio
family
migratorio del
clearly and
minore
sincerely declare the money
moltissime,
spent, and
come
they
dicevo,
clearly
lo
mention the
dicono, fanno
efforts
riferimento
made to
a tutto
collect
quello che
that
appunto gli
money,
sforzi necessari per mettere
money
insieme
which is required by the traffickers,
il denaro necessario richiesto
and in
dai
telling
trafficanti
the
e
journey of their
nel raccontare
child
appunto il
to reach
viaggio del
Italy,
proprio
they
figlio fino ad
also
arrivare in
underline
Italia, spesso vengono
the
messi in
vulnerability,
evidenza anche
the violences
la vulnerabilità
of which these young migrants, minors or young adults are victims, because the characteristics of the migration journey are specific. And as I said before arriving in the country of destination, they have to spend months or years in transit countries such as Libya. They are reduced in a sort of slavery. They work, sometimes paid, sometimes not. They are victims of violence, maltreatment, but they have to be able to pay the journey completely and to reach the country of destination. Frequently, the families know what's happening to their child. They talk about, they report about violence, abuses. So the families are fully aware of what is happening, but it is also true that such information emerged from the social services report. So there is a discrepancy between what the family knows in details about what happened during the migration journey and what the migrants themselves tell, not at the beginning of their journey, of their new experience in the new country, but sometimes over time they talk to social workers and they confess what they have experienced. In addition, last point, last slide, about the valuable information we can collect from the conversation with the families, from the interviews with the families, is that the families in Bangladesh explains why they supported the young migrants in this migration journey. For sure, we know that the fact of having a relative or a family member in Europe is key. Most of the time we are not talking about a close family member, but maybe just a person from the same village that they know and living in Europe or in Italy. So having a person they know in the country of destination is a push factor, an extremely powerful push factor to create what we call migration chain. The network of smugglers and traffickers are very well organized, unfortunately. They are very clever and they can be divided in different groups, each one with specific characteristics. Some of this group can also exploit these young migrants, and we are talking about labor exploitation once these migrants arrive at the final destination, reach the final destination. As I was saying before, the documentary issue is that it is a very complex situation. So we try to understand and we try to ask these people to collect useful information to facilitate their permanence in Italy. Maybe it is important if they produce some documents regarding their studies or their education. It is important to have a birth certificate, possibly authentic, because it is required by the social services to
dai servizi sociali, per favore, insomma,
favor
dare
the
seguito a
residents
questa
in their
richiesta,
country. It is
spiegando
important to
l'importanza
explain to the
stessa
families how important it
di
is
una
to have papers, to have
chiara
documents,
posizione
because
documentale,
having
proprio
documents
perché solo
means
attraverso
having
questo
access
poi il ragazzo
to the
può,
country of
come
destination,
dire, riuscire
especially if
a
they become
perfezionare la sua
adult.
posizione dopo il compimento dei 18 anni. Sappiamo quanto questo è importante.
As I was saying before,
Qui
for a long
non
time
ritornerei sul discorso fatto prima rispetto alle presenze, perché
there was a
appunto
high
c'è
concentration of
stato per
unaccompanied
molto tempo
minors
una grande
from
concentrazione
Bangladesh.
di
Now
minori
their
non
presence
accompagnati,
is
adesso c'è
reduced, and we will
appunto
try
una
to understand
forte
what
diminuzione della
are the
loro presenza
factors
e, come già detto,
correlated to
cercheremo
this
di capire
change of
tutti i
route
vari
or
fattori che
change
sono
of
legati a questo
in the final
cambiamento
destination. I would like to give the
apparente
floor to
cambiamento di rotta
Cheikh,
dei flussi
and I would like to
vaccinali.
conclude my intervention with
Chiudo qui e passo la parola a
a
Cheikh
sentence of
con una
Iqbal
frase
Kadir. I would like to quote him
del
because
fondatore
it
della
explains
Lincoln,
a lot
Iqbal
about
Kadir,
the way of
che
being of the Bangladesh
istituisce molto
population.
nel modo di essere
They
della
believe
popolazione
in
bangladese,
migration, and they
che
believe in it
vede
as
e
an
crede molto
opportunity to
nella carta
have a
migratoria,
better
soprattutto
future. So it's a
nella
common trait
migrazione
of
in
the family
Europa, e
history.
ne fa
And it
un
says
po' un tratto, come
the
dire,
best way
comune
for
della
poor
propria storia
people to break
familiare.
free from poverty is to set out
Kadir
on the global
dice che il modo
highway,
migliore con cui le
not
persone
on
povere possono
any
affrancarsi
dirty
della povertà
back
è
road.
mettersi in marcia
And I think this
sull'autostrada
is a
globale,
very
non su qualunque
clear
sporca strada secondaria.
and
Ecco, questo ci sembrava
a very
che
clear
stupisse
message to explain
molto
the
bene e
mentality
molto
of this
sinteticamente la
population, which
capacità di
is
questa
deeply
popolazione di
rooted
vedersi
in the
proiettata
tradition of its country,
ovunque
but
nel
it is ready
mondo, ma
to
sempre molto
move
legata
and
poi
to
allo
travel the
stesso
world to
tempo
find a better
al
opportunity.
proprio paese di
Sheikh, you
origine.
have the floor. Just tell
Cheikh,
me when I
ti
have
passo la
to
parola.
scroll the slides.
Dimmi quando girare
Grazie
le
mille
Sorry,
slide.
I
Silvia.
was abruptly
Scusate
disconnected
prima per
before.
i
So thank you
tempi,
so
il
much,
telefono
Silvia.
il compito ha deciso a una certa di morire.
You have already
Bene, grazie mille
mentioned
Silvia per
many important
avere
elements. I will try
insomma
to be very
anticipato
brief.
quanto ecco vado a dire. Cercherò di andarci molto velocemente perché
Sylvia has
Silvia
already given
ha
you
già dato
clear
insomma
and important information,
importanti input e ha
so
già
I will be
toccato insomma
brief, and I have
alcuni
just
punti
10 minutes.
di cui insomma vado
I
a
will try to
parlare.
explain
In questi
what
10
makes
minuti vi parlo
Bangladesh
brevemente
children
insomma
vulnerable
di
before
cosa rende
they
il
leave,
Bangladesh
before their
vulnerabile prima
departure, and
di
the
intraprendere il
acquired
viaggio migratorio
vulnerabilities.
e infine le vulnerabilità
I
acquisite,
will try
quindi quelle
to
vulnerabilità che acquisiscono quando lasciano il
give
proprio
you some
paese d'origine.
examples, some
E cercherò
practical
anche di dare,
examples
diciamo, alcuni
that are the
esempi
results of my experience in the field in
pratici,
Sicily
insomma, che
first,
derivano dalla mia esperienza sul field, prima in
as
Sicilia,
operated working in a
in
reception center, but
quanto
also at the
insomma,
arrival.
operatore che
And
interveniva
this is
sia
also
nei
the
centri di
results of
accoglienza
my
come in punti di
experience in the
sbarco e
results
poi
of labor
insomma dalla recente
exploitations.
esperienza nell'ambito del contrasto allo
We
sfruttamento
had the
lavorativo,
opportunity to
dove si è
know
venuti insomma
and to become familiar with many
a
new
conoscenza
situations
di
of
tante
employment
situazioni di
involving
sfruttamento lavorativo
young
di
Bangladeshi.
giovani
Younger
adulti
age
originari insomma del
is
Bangladesh. Cosa rende i
the
minori
main
bangladesi vulnerabili prima di
vulnerable
intraprendere il
factor.
viaggio migratorio?
17% of the
Sicuramente insomma la
population
minore età.
is
Come abbiamo visto prima,
between
il
10
17%
and
della
19 years
popolazione
old, and in Italy,
bangladese ha tra
from
10 e 19 anni
2014
e
to
in Italia
2016, out of
dal
more than
2016 al 2014 su
230,000 migrants from Bangladesh,
20.232 minori stranieri non
almost 6%, which
migrati
means
originari
almost
sono in
4,000,
Bangladesh, il
are
6%, quindi
unaccompanied minor
quasi 8.000
migrants. So
sono,
the age is
sono minori
a
stranieri non
vulnerable
accompagnati. Quindi la
factor,
loro età
exposing them
è
to
un
different
fattore di
risks,
vulnerabilità a
risks
livello
of
individuale, li espone
exploitation,
insomma a dei
risks
rischi
of abuse,
di sfruttamento,
and
a dei rischi
risk
insomma
of being
di
object of
abusi
trafficking, human trafficking.
di traffico
Another important
brokers
element to remember is poverty.
insomma citato la collega Silvia.
As data confirmed,
la povertà che come è stato confermato,
physical and sexual abuse suffered in the country of origin or in the country of transit, and the low level of education contributes to their vulnerability. As Silvia told us before, in most of the cases, young unaccompanied migrants from Bangladesh arrive in transit country, most of the time in small transit countries, and they spend long time in countries such as Libya, because they have to prepare the journey, they have to collect the sum of money needed to pay traffickers and smugglers and to reach the country of destination, Italy in this case. During the time they spent in the country of origin or in the country of transit exposes them to different kind of risks, labor exploitation, but also physical and sexual exploitation. Another risk factor is correlated to religious minorities. Silvia mentioned the
legato alle minoranze religiose. Prima la collega Silvia ci ha
the
parlato
Ahmadiyya minorities, which is a Muslim group. They are called the Ahmadiyya, and membership of Rohingya groups or also other groups like the Biharis. So they are religious minorities from Pakistan who were persecuted during the War of Independence in Bangladesh in 1971, and according to some sources of freedom fighters, the freedom fighters killed almost 600,000 people belonging to these religious minorities. And another vulnerable factor or factor of vulnerability is sexual orientation, the fact of belonging to ethnic groups, but also natural disaster that represents a remarkable and important push factors, reaching almost 1%. But people from Bangladesh leave their country also for natural disaster or condition related to the territory. Silvia, can you go on with the presentation?
Sì. Benissimo.
Ok. Allora, scusateci. Quindi insomma, dopo le vulnerabilità insomma dei minori, prima di lasciare il paese di origine, prima che mi scordo il fattore.
After the vulnerability is acquired by the Bangladeshi when they arrive in Italy, another important factor to mention is the level of education. Most of the time we deal with young migrants with a very low level of education, and it is clear also by reading the DTM report. Only 4% of the interviewees have a complete cycle of education. In Italy, they are vulnerable because they are isolated, and this is due to the lack of Bangladeshi mediators to help. But experience has taught us that mediators are essential in the reception center and when at the arrival. So it is crucial to have people that can communicate with these minors to pave the way for a clear communication and to inform them about the declaration, they shouldn't do the fact that if they give false information, this could compromise their future in this country. And this is particularly important, and I would like to answer Emiliano by saying that I was reading your question, and I would like to answer. I coordinate a center in the province of Arezzo, and we are welcoming young people from Bangladesh. When they arrived, they didn't ask for asylum, so they are not asylum seeker. And now they are facing huge difficulties to have passport, to have a residence permit. They can be victims of traffickers. In most of the cases, unfortunately, Bangladeshi young people arrive with a lot of information, but wrong information given by brokers or traffickers, and they follow the indication of their family members, information given to the family members by the network of traffickers and smugglers. So they have many information, but they have the wrong information. And when they arrive in the reception center, it is very difficult to teach them new information, to give them new information, to guarantee a level of communication. So they are linked to those information, and with the huge difficulties we try to convince them, and we convince them to declare the truth, to declare to be minor, to show the right document, the right certificate of birth, because they are full of misinformation and they believe in the wrong information given. They think that if they declare to be adults, they can easily work. I remember that between 2014 and 2016, all minors from Bangladesh arriving in the area in Italy, they had a certificate of birth. Most of the time, they were counterfeited certificate of birth. So our task is to give information about protection and give information about the project, the migration project, and the project that the operators are preparing for them, would like to share with them, and would like to start with them, because the risk is that these young migrants are, of course, subject to provisions, to orders by the anti-crime police or by the police, and also in the reception center they can compromise the plan, the project created and developed for them. Can you imagine an adult person who declares to be minor and who is excluded from a project or included in a project, but on the basis of false information? You can imagine how difficult it can be. And in this case, it is also important to remember that the family has great expectation. They would like to meet the expectation of the family. They would like to work. So it is difficult to convince them that there are some problems, especially if they trust the families and the information given by smugglers and traffickers. About the jobs they do, well, in most of the cases they are in most of the cases, sorry, I'm having a problem, but in most of the cases they work as street vendors of toys, umbrellas, necklaces, often on behalf of those who rent the house in which they are housed or hosted. They also work in the countryside, especially in Sicily and in Marche region. I have met many new young adults working in the
parlando con
field,
loro, insomma,
and talking to
sono
them,
venuta a sapere che nella maggior
I
parte dei
have
casi
discovered that
non sono
in most
riusciti
of the
proprio a
cases they were
ottenere
not able
un
to
passaporto
obtain a
utile per
passport
convertire, ad esempio, il permesso di soggiorno per minore età
to
in permesso di soggiorno
convert
per
the residence
permesso
permit
di lavoro.
into
Ritornando,
a
insomma,
permit
la
for working
tendenza è di
reasons. So
rifugiarsi con i loro
trend,
pari,
the
che già
trend
sanno
is
di
to
avere
remain
progetti
close in
migratori diversi,
ghettos
insomma, da quello
because they
dei
have a
minori stranieri,
different
in particolare,
migration project.
vi dicevo prima. Difficile accesso ai
It is very
servizi
difficult for
pubblici,
them to access
perché
to
nella maggior
public
parte dei
services
casi
because in most of the
la
cases
difficoltà
the
nell'apprendimento della lingua
difficulties in
italiana e la
speaking
ghettizzazione con i
Italian,
propri
the
pari
fact
non
that they are
garantiscono
isolated and
aiuto,
they
insomma,
spend
no?
most of the time
a,
with their fellow
a
countrymen.
renderli, diciamo, più integrati nel tessuto sociale, e
It
a
is a
questo si
limit
aggiunge
to
anche
their
l'impossibilità di
integration,
ottenere
and
dei documenti per poter
it
beneficiare
is difficult
di
for
servizi
them to
pubblici
obtain
disponibili.
documents and to benefit from
Sempre
public
parlando delle
services.
vulnerabilità
Talking about
acquisite, il
acquired
vincolo del legame familiare
vulnerabilities,
che compromette il
it is
progetto
important to
educativo del
remember
minore. Questo è
the
molto
family
importante, quindi
commitment.
uno
It is
ascolto
important to remember that
e
they come
una buona
here
comunicazione con il
because
minore per
there is a
garantire
family
la
behind them. So
partecipazione
it is
dei
important to
minori qui è
involve
molto
these young
importante per
migrants to
capire,
have a
perché a noi le
clear
indagini
and
familiari ci aiutano
transparent
molto a
communication.
capire quali
And
sono le aspettative dei
it is
familiari
important to
del
remember
minore e
that there
qual è
is a
l'aspettativa del
constraint,
minore
the constraint of the family
nel
mandate,
paese di
compromise in the
destinazione, e questo
educational project
aiuta
of the
chi
minors. So
lavora, ad
some
esempio,
minors
all'interno dei centri di accoglienza
should be
di tagliare, no? Un piano, un
supported
percorso
and they should be
consono,
able to
insomma, alle
create
esigenze
their own
del minore.
project
Il
according
forte
to their
legame con
own
la
needs and
comunità
not to the family
che li fa
mandates. They
trascorrere
have
la
a
maggior parte del
strong
tempo solo
bond
insomma, se
with
non riescono
their community, strong
come
ties to
lavorativo,
their
come
community, and this makes them spending
alcuni
most
minori
of their
fuori del
time
circuito di
only with their
accoglienza vengono
fellow countrymen.
sempre ospitati in abitazioni affollate di connazionali
Some of
vivendo
them,
dagli
well, I would
250
say the
euro al
majority
mese
of
per il
them
costo letto,
lives
e spesso
in
sono ricongiunti al
houses
connazionale comunque che gli danno
often
la
overcrowded
merce
with
da
fellow
andare a vendere,
countrymen paying an
e poi
average of
chiedendogli di
250
condividere
euros per
l'affitto
month for a
della
bed, and
casa
they
senza pagargli uno
sell
stipendio, senza un
the
contratto,
goods that these people
eccetera,
give
eccetera.
them. They work as street vendors.
Ecco,
In
qui
this slide,
riferisco
we would like to
la mia
share
parte,
with
finisce
you
anche la
some
presentazione. Qui
of
avete
the
alcune
resources
risorse che abbiamo voluto
we are
condividere,
using.
che sono il sito del
The
GTM,
website
dove
of
potete trovare anche la
DTM
ricerca
IOM
di cui
Italy,
parlavamo,
and in that website you
è il
will
sito del
find
Ministero
the
del
report
Lavoro,
we were
che
mentioning
menzionavo
before.
prima, Alessandra,
It
dove
could be useful
potete
to
trovare
use
dei
the
rapporti
website
semestrali,
of the
insomma, che
Ministry of Labors, where you can
il
find
Ministero mette a
monthly
disposizione nel
reports
sito, che vede anche
or
il nostro contributo e i contributi di altre
reports
agenzie.
published every
Qui
6 months,
approfondire
and
anche
then
per
you
capire
can
un pochino i
find
rischi, no?
additional
E i risk factor
information about
legati,
the
insomma,
risk
alle
factors,
minoranze religiose, la
about
questione dei
religious
Biharis. Potete
minorities,
approfondire
about the
anche
Biharis
alcune questioni
issue,
riguardo
and you
le
can
comunità
also find
Ahmadiyya
additional information
e
about the
Rohingya.
Ahmadiyya community
Quindi
and
vi
Rohingya community.
ringrazio
Thank you
per
so much.
l'attenzione.
Thank you for your kind attention.
The floor is yours. Se avete delle domande
If you have
o
additional
insomma
questions,
commenti.
feel
Grazie
free
mille.
to ask and to write
Grazie
your
mille
comments.
Cheikh anche per questa
Thank you,
preziosissima
Cheikh,
slide, appunto
also for
con
this
una
very
serie
valuable
di
slide
risorse e
full of
appunto fonti da consultare
precious
per
resources
aggiornarsi
to
su
learn and
questa
to
tematica.
know more about this
Non so se ci
aspect.
sono altre domande o
Are there
altri
other
contributi da
questions
parte
or
dei nostri
other
partecipanti.
contributes,
Abbiamo un po'
comments?
sforato, quindi
We are
probabilmente
slightly late, so
no,
probably
è il caso
not.
di chiudere.
It's
Io
time to
ringrazio tutti,
conclude. I would
invito
like
laddove
to
voleste
thank you all.
rivolgere contributi,
If
domande,
you
questioni da...
want to
c'è
share
una domanda,
other information, there is a
forse?
question. Maybe, let me check.
Dall'esperienza del SAI di Caserta,
From the
i giovani
experience of
migranti
Sai of
bengalesi
Caserta,
accolti come
young
minori hanno fatto delle
migrants
corsi di
from
autonomia
Bangladesh were able to follow autonomous project, and of course with all the difficulties and vulnerabilities, but yes, critical aspects are part of the project, but it is important to remember that we have also many positive experiences. So it is important to take into account the pressure put on their shoulders by the families and it is important for them to become autonomous. But yes, another important aspect to underline is that on the one hand, the community is also a risk factor for unaccompanied minors from Bangladesh, but at the same time, it is a positive aspect. It represents factors linked to resilience. It is a very close community. Many minors were supported by the same community, and the same community helped them to find cultural mediators, linguistic mediators, so that they could be assisted during their journey. So remember that vulnerability factors sometimes are at the same time positive factors, a factor that can be used to improve their life, the quality of their life, and to protect them. And also the diplomatic representative of Bangladesh, they paid attention to our requests and supported us, especially for the documents and especially to help these people in their journey and in their permanence in Italy. That was just my conclusion. Alessandra, very briefly, for Emiliano Pereda, who asked the question about documents, what we do about the project we carry out, that sometimes clashes with the difficulties to have a residence permit. When you are responsible for a child, a minor coming from Bangladesh, it is important to focus on the single story because it could be a specific case. There could be a family with a huge debt to pay. So there could be very specific factors that could be used to find very specific solutions. So they are vulnerable because of the reasons we have mentioned, but also because of the problems related to documents. So it is important to talk and find a common solution. We could consider not only a fake request for international protection, but a real request for international protection, because there could be elements that can justify such a request. So I kindly invite you to adopt this approach, especially for these minors, migrant minors. Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, Chidi. Thank you, Cheikh. And thanks to all the participants. Thank you all. Thank you, Silvia, and thank you, Cheikh. And these meetings, these webinars are valuable also for participants connected from other countries. Thank you so much for this seminar, for the previous seminar. You gave us valuable contribution, valuable information for our work, but also for the work at international level. sometimes we do not have this international dimension, we do not have this international network, but we strongly believe in monitoring, in constant confrontation, and in a collective approach. We strongly believe in a community-minded approach, which is the only one solution. Sometimes we do not pay sufficient attention to the specific features and specific characteristics of every country. But for this target of migrants, we know more thanks to your contribution, and we know that for every single group it is important to shape a journey. The journey should be tailor-made according to the condition of the country of origins, to the conditions of the families, and of the cultural context. Thank you so much, and see you on Thursday to talk about Albania and minor migrants coming from Albania and traveling to Europe. Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.